we start with some of the earliest Qurans that we have preserved. They are from the Hijazi region and Saudi Arabia, and they are still written in sort of cursive script. But then, not too long after, there was an entire script system that we call Kufic today, invented for the writing of Quranic manuscripts. And the rest of those show you different varieties of this new type of script. In response, we would say, to the other visual cultures around, early Islamic artists developed an Islamic artistic language on their own, and they focused very much on the holy text of the Quran and on making the text itself beautiful. And at the very end, there's one of my favorite objects in the exhibition, actually, the nurse's Quran, or rather bifolio of the nurse's Quran, which was this huge manuscript, many volumes, maybe 30 volumes, because each line, there are only 5 lines on each page. So maybe it was used to show it around, to show it to the congregation. And the nurse's Quran has its name from a nurse, in fact, the nurse who gave this Quran, the nurse of a Zivil prince in Kairouan in Tunisia, who gave this Quran to the mosque. And I like this because for many of these fantastic manuscripts, we do not really have an idea who made the Qurans or who donated them. But for this one we do, and it is in fact a woman. So it is a story that would be lost if it was not for the coincidence of this manuscript having survived. And it tells us a lot about early Muslim society functioning, and that it was perfectly normal for women having the means and also the social standing to give a Quran to a mosque.
This goddess was originally part of a Buddhist shrine in northeast India, and at some point in 1000 to 1400 AD, somebody took the stone, probably simply because they needed more stone, and they turned it round and they carved it on the other side with an intricate decorative pattern to make the wall of a mosque. Before they did that, they very carefully chiseled out the elements of the goddess that would allow us to work out exactly which goddess was depicted. So this was done by somebody who understood the Buddhist tradition that they were engaging with. They knew which attributes were general, which attributes were specific, and they chiseled those off, taking away the religious nature of the object and transforming it into a piece of spare stone that could then be used for a new building project. This is the recarving, and we have intricate floral motifs, non-figural in nature, appropriate for use in a mosque, and originally the back of this slab was probably unfinished, and so it provided an opportunity to rework it. Spare stone is always expensive, and this is not the only example. Several other examples from the same site survive, including on the back of an image of the Buddha, the prayer niche, which would have marked the direction of Mecca. So the opening of the exhibition contains 5 objects representing 5 different faiths, and what distinguishes these objects from almost everything else you see in the exhibition is their date. These are from 1500 or so or later, and the Buddha behind me is emblematic of what we're trying to do with that section. It's from Tibet, it's from the 15th century, and nothing we're going to tell you about when we come to Buddhism is from that place or from that time. What we're doing is showing you here that all of these imageries are part of the world that you live in now, right? we're first of all introducing that, showing the role that they play today, showing something that's familiar, before we take you back to the first millennium, from 1 to 1000 AD, which is the period in which most of these imageries were formed, the period in which they drew on influences and other cultures to create the first examples. And the reason we're doing that is because when you come to those sections, the context will be unfamiliar. It will be a context that's now lost to us. So here at the very beginning, we start with something current and familiar.
So, for example, in the first room, we have a number of pagan objects, some wonderful heads of Zeus and of other deities that are a bit like Zeus, that borrow aspects of Zeus, which are bearded. And on the other hand, we have images of Dionysus, the great god Dionysus, who is beardless. And then we move into the ways these identities, these iconographies are borrowed to make the image of Jesus in the early Christian period. So on the one hand, you have a beardless Jesus, and on the other hand, for example, there's a little silver censer with the bearded Jesus that we nowadays recognize.
Of the Hinton St. Mary mosaic, which is a 4th century Roman mosaic, and in this particular fragment we have a depiction of Christ, probably the earliest depiction of Christ north of the Alps. To contextualize it, because the original is enormous, we have a black and white image of the whole mosaic immediately behind me. And what's interesting about this image is the way in which it incorporates an early Christian imagery into wider ancient Roman imagery. The whole mosaic contains an image of the hero Bellerophon, but Christ himself here is depicted in the guise of a Roman emperor.
He appears looking a bit like a Roman emperor, but with the Chi Rho, the image, the charismatic image of the first two letters of Christ behind his head in a kind of halo.
Right? And this is borrowing existing religious imagery, existing imperial imagery, to create a new imagery for the Christian community.
And then we move into the Jewish section. We've got manuscripts that unroll this way, manuscripts that unroll this way, both kinds of rolls, and then a codex, manuscript that unrolls that way. So you see the experimentation of different formats of scripture, of text, which is, if you like, the medial revolution of transportable text not written just on inscriptions, but movable text, which is what transmits religion and transmits iconography through the period of the first millennium. And the Hindus are very interesting because, unlike other religions which differentiate from each other, choose forms of imagery that are different from each other, what the Hindus do is they take groups of different cults and deities and they bring them together into a single, larger, more grander deity.
This is the third avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu. Vishnu incarnates himself as an avatar, in this case the boar Varaha, in order to restore order and stability to the world. Here he dives into the primordial ocean and he lifts up the earth out of the waters, the earth represented by the beautiful goddess hanging from his tusk.
The wonderful image of the boar, for example, the boar incarnation who saves the world in the form of a beautiful goddess from the primordial ocean, and he's carrying her off.
This section of the museum explores 10 of Vishnu's avatars and shows how each of them relates to other religious traditions, to artistic conceptions that existed from 1 to 1000 AD, and how all of them together are gradually created, gradually assembled into one coherent story about Vishnu's interventions that covers the whole, a process that covers the whole of the first millennium AD. This is a fragment of a larger statue of the Buddha. It welcomes people into the section that we have on the earliest Buddhist images, and it makes the Abhaya Mudra, the sign of reassurance, to tell the devotee not to be afraid, not to be concerned. It's among the earliest examples of Buddhist imagery that are available to us, and it comes from the city of Mathura, which were in northern India, which was a centre of religious activity throughout the first millennium AD. Final section of the exhibition features 3 carved stones from Wales, England and Scotland, which include elements of both Christian imagery, so we have crosses on the things, but also elements of pre-existing local traditions.
The beginning of the visual identities of what we now know as the world religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism and Hinduism, when they came together, when they acquired those identities in the period that we know as late antiquity, roughly the first millennium after Christ, or the Arabs under Muhammad conquered extraordinary territory, extraordinarily large amount of territory, right up to the Indian border on one side and right across to Spain within a very short period of time, across North Africa. And they assimilated and they controlled hugely different cultures with a vast range of different visual identities. And early Islam, what we see is its way of assimilating those identities and playing with them until finally, in contradiction to the Christians on the West, who use flat icons of Christ and of the saints, and against the Hindus and the Buddhists in the East, who use three-dimensional statues, Islam develops a fondness, a predilection for non-figural imagery, scriptural imagery around the Quran. Think of Stonehenge, amazing, very, very ancient standing stones, large-scale constructs of many of these, and there's a long history, and especially a landscape history of sacred places marked, whether it's by wooden circles or by stone circles or by barrows or by single standing stones. It's a very, very rich tradition, and some of these stones become sculpted and carved in different ways, and these are different to different parts of what's now the United Kingdom, different in Ireland, different in Wales with different kinds of scripts, different among the Pictish people, never themselves conquered by the Romans in the north, the Scottish part of the United Kingdom, and different again in the different parts of England. And these become these indigenous traditions, which are then repeated on, for example, on torques and bracelets and gold and silver jewellery, on goblets, on all kinds of objects. These become, these traditions get taken up and assumed into a Christian culture, whether the imagery is used on books, or whether it's used on standing crosses. We have a wonderful standing cross in the show, actually, or whether it's used in, for example, reliquaries or sacred goblets, cups, crosses in gold, this kind of thing, so that in a way there is, and then of course the sites, the great sacred sites, are often adapted to church sites, so that churches are founded on previous temple complexes. And you have a weird mixture of syncretism and assimilation that it really gives great richness, actually, to the Anglo-Saxon Christianity of the British Isles. One of the things the show explores, in a way, are different concepts of God. We have to be quite careful, because God, in the sense we normally think of him, in quotation marks, dangerous terminology there, although the Abrahamic religions have been very patriarchal in the way they've expressed it, has been around a monotheistic, Abrahamic, that is to say Jewish, Christian, Islamic model. More or less representable, so neither the Muslims nor the Jews are very keen on representing God. The Christians have been more open to the possibility, because they believed God to be incarnate in a person, and therefore the human form could embody God. But that monotheistic model is itself a reaction to the multiplicity of polytheisms in the pre-Christian, the pre-Jewish, the pre-Islamic worlds, where there were many gods, and those gods could flow rather freely into each other, So you could combine Zeus with Serapis, and you'd have Zeus Serapis, or Zeus with Ammon, and you'd combine, and you have Zeus Ammon. We have examples of that in the exhibition. And these things are themselves very different again from the kind of hero cults and rich superhuman figures, the deity figures of an Indian culture, which could then be merged, as in the image of Vishnu, as the kind of god, but with numerous avatars or incarnations, and with indeed other kinds of Indian deity complexes, like Shiva and his whole cult and entourage, or Brahma, which is a separate series of cults and entourage. So it's a very, very rich, intermingled multiplicity of deities in a kind of universe that, in a certain sense, parallels the richness and complexity of the human world. In Buddhism, there is a deep rejection, actually, of the notion of God altogether. They don't say there is no God, they say the gods aren't really very important, and instead you have freedom from the cycle of suffering created through the person of the Buddha's enlightenment and the possibility that others can receive, attain enlightenment themselves. So again, it's a very different pattern. The exhibition attempts to see religion through the orbit of visual and material culture as much as through texts. We think of religions often as scriptural, but for their adherents, they are about devotion, they are about objects, they're about spaces in which objects define the quality of the experience, and so we've been looking at that aspect primarily in this project.